Okay, welcome. Welcome to Temple University, Japan. I'm Robert Jarek from the Institute for Contemporary Asian Studies. We're extremely happy to have Rick Katz, who has already lectured at our school, and it's always a great pleasure to have him come back. He's the editor of the Oriental Economist, to which you should all subscribe. I subscribe to it. I think there's, I don't know if there's your website, but afterwards during the Q&A we can show the website. Right here. Okay, website orientaleconomist.com. It's a monthly newsletter about Japan, Japanese politics, the economy, trade, as well as security issues, and it really provides the best summary you can get in English or in Japanese, for that matter, of what's happening in Japan every month. So I urge you to read it and subscribe to it. Just before we start, if you have a mobile phone, you should put it on vibrate. If you're not on our mailing list and you'd like to be included in our events, you can give us your business card. And if you want to contribute to the Institute, you can also donate money. Can you imagine, maybe you can show our ballot box? Here it is. That's our ballot box. It's empty now because no one has voted with his money. So we take coins and cash. We prefer bills to coins because once we only got 319 yen, so we like to move to the bills, preferably the big ones. So without further ado, Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is a problem. Well, don't applaud, you haven't heard it yet, it may not be worth it. But I talk with my hands, so I'm not sure what I'm going to do here. I had a really upsetting conversation last night. I was speaking to an old friend of mine who's a DPJ member of the Diet. He's a first termer. He's a really good guy, despite the fact that he supports the consumption tax hike. But he's a real, genuine reformer. He's a genuine article. He's very, very smart, very forward-looking, very young. And he won in 2009, no landslide. When I saw him in December, he said he thought he would win again this year, or whenever the election is. But whereas in 2009 he won because he was DPJ, this time he'd have to win despite being DPJ. He now says that as a result of all the stuff that's going on the consumption tax and other kinds of things, that if the Ishin party, Hashimoto's party, decides to run a candidate against him, he's from the Kansai region, his situation is hopeless. The Hashimoto people have asked him whether he wants to run on their ticket, and even though he goes against every grade in his body, he's seriously considering the offer because he says your first job as a politician to survive. So that is incredibly depressing to me. And it seems to me it's one of the costs of what Noda has done with this consumption tax. I had written back in December that a hike in the consumption tax did not have a snowball's chance in hell. And so usually people often begin speeches in Japan with an apology, so I've never done that, but I thought, well, maybe I should apologize for having said that, but I don't think it's my fault. I think it was misunderstood. When I said it didn't have a snowball's chance in hell, what I meant was it had much higher chance. And if you believe that, I've got some various things I'd like to sell you. So the question is, why did it pass? Why did it change to something which very much looked like it couldn't pass, was death knell to the politicians, something did pass? Well, first of all, the LDP changed its view from being the party of no to going along with it. And they figured, because they began to be blamed by the public for being too obstructionist because they thought they could use it to widen fissures within the DPJ. But another reason, which brings me to the topic at hand, is this scare story being sold by the MOF, that unless they do it, Japan would be the next Greece. Or could be the next Greece. It's not the fire next door. Khan had said it, and therefore blew the upper house election, or blew any chance of recovering from what Hashimoto had done. And then Noda kept repeating it. And it's just, in my view, utter and complete nonsense. And it's something from having spoke with MOF officials, they themselves don't believe. What they'll say is, well, at some point, eventually, we can't go on running this debt forever. And markets are kind of irrational, blah, 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 blah. So, they couch stuff more carefully, but you get these politicians who want to sell a story, Let's scare the hell out of people and say, we could become the next Greece unless we do it now. And all kinds of other things have been sacrificed, other issues that the Prime Minister should be counting on, should be doing in order to push the consumption tax. Now, Noda seems to me is a man with only one thing on his mind. And usually, you know, when we say a man has got only one thing on his mind, we're not usually talking about taxes. I think it's another word that ends in X. But in the case of Noda, it's taxes. This guy wants to raise taxes. And that's his main priority. I was meeting last night with a fellow, an auto from one of the auto companies in the consulate area, about how, he was talking about how disruptive the energy shortage was last year. He said, why do we have to pass the consumption tax now? The most urgent issue is energy. You know, we have to get our energy back online. And I agree with that. No matter what your view is about the long-term role of nuclear power in Japan, and that can be debated, whatever your view of that is, somehow Japan's got to get through the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And it's hard for me to see how it can do it without nuclear power being part of the equation. I really don't see how you can do it. And yet, in order to, so I forget how many DPJers signed this anti-nuclear petition to not open the reactors in Fukui. So until Noda, there was like a lot. And until Noda actually had the sort of the semi-endorsement of the DPJ for the consumption tax, he did not say a word about nuclear power, not one word. Adano was talking about it, and Adano kept saying opposite things, including one day, you know, we're going to start up another day, the summer shortage should not be a factor, the only factor should be safety. And then they get the consumption tax semi-endorsement by the party, and suddenly Noda says, now we've got to have these reactors, and the issue is summer shortage. And in 2 weeks, they put together these alleged safety precautions, which were worse than doing nothing at all, because they were such a sham that they made people even more distrustful of the government than ever. I think the big casualty of Fukushima, aside from all the other casualties, is the level of distrust of the government has risen, and democracy needs a certain minimum level of trust. I think today, if Noda said the sun rose in the east, people would look out their window just to make sure. I mean, that's the level of distrust, and deserved distrust, by the way. When Noda said that they had a cheap cold shutdown at Fukushima, a poll showed 84% of people did not believe him. That's a real problem for democracy. The Trans-Pacific Partnership has been put off. All kinds of other things have been put off. The DPJ is by most every prediction I've seen, is going to get smashed in this election, whenever it's held. And you have people turning to, a lot of people turning to Hashimoto. Now, I don't know much about him at all, and so I'm not in a position to make a judgment, but a lot of people that I talk to certainly really think the guy is dangerous. Whether he is or is not, I don't know. But he could be in a position to be a kingmaker, given the outcome of the elections. So the cost of doing this was very high. And yet they did it because of the scare, partly because of the scare story about Japan being the next Greece. So that brings us to why I think that is nonsense. Okay, now, I should start off by saying, hi, I'm Rick, I'm a chartaholic. I'm not a recovering chartaholic, I'm just down in the deep, never going to stop chartaholic. And this is one of the more snazzy ones. So, here we go. So, on the, no? Here we go, no? All right, who turned off the lights? Here we go, okay. So on this axis is the ratio of net debt, net government debt to GDP. You can see Japan's way up there, here's Greece, right? Okay, so it's very, very high. On this axis is the current accounts balance. Above the line, you have a surplus in the current account. At the bottom, below the line, you have a deficit. Now the current account is the sum of the trade deficit and income abroad, but what it really shows is what's the level of savings in your economy compared to the level of borrowing. So if you have enough savings in your economy so that you can supply the needs of households who want to borrow for big ticket items, of corporations who want to borrow to invest or whatever, and the government wants to borrow, and if you still have savings left over, you lend them to the rest of the world so they can buy your Toyotas. And if you don't, you borrow from the rest of the world so you can buy their Toyotas, or their oil, or their whatever. So what we see is every single crisis country is in the lower right-hand quadrant, which means not only did it have a big level of government debt, but also ran really big current account deficits. So here's a case, say, Greece and Portugal, where they were borrowing from the rest of the world. This is an average during the five years, 2005 and 2010. Actually, it's 6 years. 10 to 12% of GDP each year, borrowing from the rest of the world. So they are very vulnerable to capital flight. If the foreigners should take their money out, then suddenly interest rates go up, companies fail, you can't afford to buy the oil, you can't afford to buy the spare parts, your economy goes down, which causes foreigners to flee it even more, you have a vicious cycle. And we had the Lehman shock and the recession from the Lehman shock, the global recession, and all the property booms in Europe. The reaction to that was these countries went into a tailspin. That set off the capital flight, and we're off to the races. Now, if you look at these countries that are in the upper right-hand box, we see some of them, many of them, have debt levels just as high as the crisis countries. Notice, by the way, that not every country in the right-hand box went into crisis, only some of them. But not a single country in the upper right-hand quadrant has gotten into crisis, because they have a current account surplus, which is to say, they can fund their own debts. They don't need to borrow from foreigners. So to be in crisis, you required both an internal problem and an external problem. Now, if I did a chart of the Asian financial crisis in 97, 98, you would see exactly the same thing. It was not countries which only had a an internal banking crisis alone did not go into crisis. It was the countries which had both an internal banking problem and large chronic current account deficits that were vulnerable to capital flight, which is one of the reasons why these Asian nations are so determined never again to have chronic current account deficits. They don't want to be vulnerable again, right? So, now, if Japan should turn from being a current account surplus country to a current account deficit country, then we would be in a different ballgame, or begin to be in a different ballgame. And some people say that's going to happen. Which brings us to our next chart. The current account surplus is the sum of the surplus in trade, which is, all right, here we go. Well, which is the black stuff, black bars, forget the light. It's the black bars. And your net income from overseas investments, right, which is light gray along the column, which means your interest on bonds you bought overseas, the profits of your companies that build plants overseas, the dividends from stocks, whatever. And what we see is that last year, after the March crisis, Japan has a trade deficit. But over time, more and more of the current account surplus has not been the trade surplus, it's been the income from abroad. And that's going to continue. It's very possible that Japan could become a chronic trade deficit country in the next 4, 5, 6, 7 years. It's very, very possible for all kinds of reasons. All right, which would be a drastic change from the past 50 years. But because of the income from abroad, the trade deficit would have to be mammoth, like 2 or 3% of GDP, to overcome the income flow. And that, I think, is certainly not likely to occur within the next 10 years, if it ever occurs. It's not sure. The BOJ says probably sometime between the next 5 and 30 years it might occur. So that's the precision of the analysis. But I think within the next 10 years, no. But even when it does, it's still not a problem, or still not a crisis, because of this. Now, the difference between this chart and the first page is that the vertical, instead of being the current account surplus or deficit, is your built-up cumulative assets overseas. So this is all the factories you own, and all the offices you own, and all the stocks and bonds and all the other stuff, right? Again, every crisis country is a net debtor. In this case, in these countries, to the tune of 100 to 125% of GDP that they owe foreign investors, right? But in the case of these countries, none of which have gone into crisis, they're all in surplus. In Japan, it's about 60% of GDP, a third of which is owned by the government. So if there ever were capital flight, the government and private players could sell off some of these assets to deal with it. So it seems to me that the odds of a current account crisis in the next 10 years, well, not zero, are very, very small. And then you have to say, you have to balance that risk against the risk of what is the cost of pushing through this cap consumption tax now. Is it worth it? And I would argue no. One of the things is that, in my view, Japan's chronic budget deficits are not the source of Japan's problems, they're a symptom of Japan's problems. And the basic problem is that Japan has been unable to grow at a decent rate for years and years and years. So you look at this chart. This chart shows what's called the primary balance in the budget. The primary balance means your spending and your taxes, everything except for the interest payments on past debt, right? So during the bubble era, this was in surplus. It's below the line, it's in surplus, right? Because you had high growth. Then you begin to go into the lost decades, and you begin to go into deficit to the tune of, 1% of GDP, fine. Then you hit the 97-98 recession, banking crisis, etc., and it grows to about 3 to 4% of GDP. Then you have a recovery in 2002, 2007, and the primary deficit goes down to about 1% of GDP. Right? Now, once you get down below zero, you begin, this is very, very important for fiscal sustainability. You begin to get more control over your problem. But then you get the global recession following the Lehman shock, and suddenly it jumps up as a reflection of the recession to 7 to 8% of GDP. So if you want to bring down the budget deficit, get some growth. And if you're not growing, you can raise taxes all you want, but then you're chasing your own tail. Now, I ought to mention about this is that one of the factors in this terrible recession of 97, 98, I'm sorry, when I move my thing here, can people not hear me if I move it out? If you can't hear me at some point, just raise your hand. I'll remember to move the mic back. I use my hands a lot to talk. Okay, so, or just say, stop moving. All right. One of the factors was that Japan raised the consumption tax in the spring of 1997. There were people who warned Japan it was premature to raise taxes. Nonetheless, the finance ministry assured Prime Minister Hashimoto the recovery was strong enough to sustain a tax hike, just as they're assuring Noda. They did the tax hike, and it was one of the factors, not the only factor, but one of the factors that triggered Japan's worst recession in the post-World War II era up until the most recent one. And so there's a risk there. There's a risk. I'm not saying that Japan will have a recession because they raised the consumption tax, but there's certainly a real risk when we don't know what the world economy is going to look like in 2014. The US recovery is sluggish. Disappointing. We don't know what's going to kick into high gear. The European situation is really, really troubling. And these people seem determined to do a Herbert Hoover act with this idea that somehow austerity creates growth. And Lord knows how that's going to go. It's a very uncertain situation. Now, there is a kind of escape clause in the consumption tax, which is good, which is 6 months before it's supposed to kick in. The cabinet can meet, and if Japan is in a recession or other factors make it look too bad, they can delay it or whatever, do what they want. So there is an escape clause, and that's good, but they're hell-bent not to use it. The same escape clause was there in 1997. They decided not to use it. I mean, if there's an actual recession in Japan, they're not going to raise the taxes, I don't think. The more difficult situation is if it looks as if it's a recovery, but the recovery is not as strong as it looks, and they go ahead, that's where we get the risk. Now, one of the things that would trigger, capital flight trigger a problem, is when the interest on the debt becomes unaffordable. But what we look here is even though the debt has risen and mushroomed and mushroomed and mushroomed, the interest payments on that debt are basically barely higher today than they were in the 1990s. And the reason for that is because interest rates are really, really low. Now, everybody, if the market was fearing a JGB crisis, as the next Greece doomsayers would tell us, then these interest rates should be rising. In fact, they're at near record lows. These are 10-year bonds. These are people saying, over the next 10 years, I don't expect a JGB crisis. I'm going to buy them to get a yield of 0.8 of 1%. Right? And as long as that remains the case, then this debt is affordable. One of the signals of a problem would be if this stuff started to rise and rise and rise. And it hasn't. It's been within this range for, since 1999? And I remember 10 years ago, right? Actually, 1997, we were told that Japan had to raise taxes because at some point, we can't keep running this deficit forever. At some point, we're going to have a crisis. So we got to raise taxes in '97. 10 years ago, the same argument. At some point, this is going to cause a crisis, and people thought it was going to be in 2003. And there's always predictions of JGB crisis in 2003. I said, I don't think so, not in the next 10 years, and we haven't had it yet, right? And if you ask for the next 10 years, it's more of a dangerous situation, but I still think it's not going to happen. But the consequences of acting actually have real costs that are serious. Now, one of the most serious problems is this. There are plenty of countries where you could have a consumption tax and that would be perfectly fine. I was in Stockholm, had a great time, got there the first night, was there in December. It was kind of weird, the country being dark at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but all right. I went to something they call Christmas Feast, because it's not called Smorgasbord at Christmas time. I was having a great time until I got the bill and found it was a 25% sales tax on my meal. Nonetheless, I liked the place. And so we seem to be doing perfectly well. So I'm not saying nobody should have a consumption tax. But in Japan, one of the chronic problems is chronically low consumption. Now, why is consumption so anemic? The finance ministry will tell you it's because people are so anxious about the budget deficit. Every day they're scurrying papers to see how big is the gross debt ratio to GDP, and has it gone up by this percentage point. So they're too anxious to spend because they're really worried about where's the taxes are going to rise in the future, or where's the Social Security going to be paid for. So they won't spend, they're too anxious to spend. Or the next day they'll tell you it's because they're reading the monetary aggregates and they're worried about deflation, and M2 plus CDs has grown too low and it's not been multiplied into bank loans for the liquidity ratio, and the yield curve, the duration effect, is not really working that well, so having seen all this, the consumers won't spend. And then newspaper reporters who are told to start writing about economics without having gotten any training in economics, will you repeatedly see phrases about penny pinching Japanese consumers, right? That one? Or consumers too anxious to spend? It just ain't so. And here's how you know it ain't so, and how the MOF knows it ain't so. I won't use the word dishonest, but you be the judge. If you got money, you're a consumer, you're going to do two things with it. Either you spend it or you don't spend it. If you don't spend it, you've saved it, right? Even if you put it in your mattress, you still saved it, right? Because you haven't spent your income. So, if people were too anxious to spend, then the savings rate would rise, the spending rate would fall, right? Make sense? Okay. The savings rate has fallen, not risen, fallen, from 13% in 1997 to 2 to 3% now, which is to say Japanese, who we've been told culturally like to save and don't like to spend, because that's part of Japanese culture, we were told. Now save less than Americans, who we are told culturally like to spend and not like to save. Okay, I don't buy it. But the point is, you can't say people are too anxious to spend, when in fact they're spending more than ever before out of their income. And part of that is aging, but part of these are all age groups, people are spending more. Why? Because their income has been so stagnant, they have to spend more to maintain their living standards. What we see here is the gray area is real disposable income. And 1997 equals 100. So, in the 15 years since 1997, real disposable income per the entire country has gone up by 0. Is this per capita or not? I think it's I forget if it's per capita or what's the total. Anyway, it has gone up by 2%. A grand total of 2% in 15 years. That's what happened to people's income. And a large part of that income is why it's grown and not fallen, is because of government budget deficits that have put money in people's pockets, either through tax cuts or through income transfers. Meanwhile, the spending has gone up a little bit more, still anemic, but a bit more, which is another way of saving. The savings have gone down. The point is, people are not spending not because of lack of will, but because of lack of wallet. If they had more money, they'd spend more. Now, so with all this in mind, the MOF is telling us, and Noda is telling us, that if we raise, and Kate Donner just gave me this lecture the other day, if we raise the consumption tax, people will spend more because they'll feel more confident about the future. They won't be as worried about these budget deficit numbers they're reading. So let me understand this. If we leave people with less money to spend, they're going to spend more. And I don't get it. I really don't get it. There's no precedent in history, there's nothing in logic, there's nothing in evidence which supports this theory. And yet, the Prime Minister of Japan seriously goes before the Diet and says this. Is it any wonder that 84% of people have no idea what he's talking about? When they ask him about Noda, does he communicate clearly? No. Well, there's no reason. Now, here's what else happens with this rise in the consumption tax. Supposedly, the purpose of the consumption tax is to fund Social Security for the elderly. Is that what's happened? Well, this chart shows the change in taxes from 1988, which is the year before the introduction of the consumption tax, and the projection for this year. So, the government's now raking in a bit more above 10 trillion yen per year in the consumption tax. It's about 2% of GDP. It's going to double that, right, in a couple of years, right? During the same period, corporate taxes have fallen. By how much? The same 10 trillion yen. Coincidence? You be the judge. So what we really had here, and this is, by the way, not because corporate profits have gone down. Corporate profits are actually higher today than they were in nominal terms back in 1988. It's because the tax rate on corporations has been repeatedly lowered, and it's going to be lowered yet again. Now, if it were the case that by shifting money from households to corporations, you got the corporations to hire people, to invest, to build stuff that would actually stimulate growth in the economy, then that would be a wonderful idea. That would be a good thing to do. But that is not what is happening in Japan. These corporations are hoarding cash, or they're investing overseas. But the investment is actually less than it was, I think, 20 years ago. The corporations are net savers to the tune of 6 to 7% of GDP. It's one of the ways in which Japan has this excess savings that it lends to people overseas. And so what you've got is a lack of capital markets that force corporations to return this money to households in the form of dividends, interest, wages, whatever. So you've really got a transfer of income from houses to corporations. The same thing, by the way, has occurred through the interest rate mechanism. But let's not get into that. So the point is, you've done a number of things which make Japan's private domestic consumer demand chronically weak. I won't go through that chart. No, I'm not going to go through these. Let me just switch and stop and say what I would do if I were king of Japan. Clearly, at some point, Japan is going to have to raise taxes. What I'm arguing is the consumption tax is the wrong tax at the wrong time. The wrong time I've just gone through. It's not urgent to do now. There are more urgent tasks. It would cause more harm than good. But what would I do instead? Well, there's a couple alternatives. One of them is the citizen ID, right, which is every other rich democracy, as far as I know, someone correct me if I'm mistaken here, has got a citizen ID that's used to track people's financial transactions, to avoid tax evasion and as well as other purposes. So you have a bank account, you've got to have your social security number or citizen ID in some other way, right? Well, in Japan, you have a huge amount of tax evasion from farmers, from self-employed people, whatever. The finance ministry did an estimate about 5 or 6 years ago how much additional tax revenue would be collected if there were a citizen ID that would avoid tax evasion. You're going to love this one. It equals a 5 percentage point rise in the consumption tax. Now, the DPJ, to its credit, put in the original consumption tax bill a provision for a taxpayer ID to be used to avoid tax evasion. The LDP insisted on taking it out, and Noda, who surrendered to the LDP on every other issue, surrendered to them on this issue as well. It's out of the bill. We don't have it. Your party is campaigning for it. Now there's a second idea, which is within 2 hours commute of Tokyo, you have a lot of what is allegedly farmland. It's fake farmland. It does not grow food, it mostly grows votes. And the LDP and the DPJ, fight over who gets to have those votes, right? These parties have an interest in actually smaller, less efficient farms, which means more rural voters, right? So, If you want to subsidize farmers, real farmers, full-time farmers, because that's a social choice you make, that's one thing. But to give this tax break to fake farmers who earn 85% of their income doing other stuff seems to me make no sense at all. Here's what I would do if I were king, or even prime minister, propose it to the Diet. Rezone this land as what it really is, which is, non-farm land. It's real land. I think the amount, last time I looked, it was actually hard to really pin down the figures because there's all kinds of different zonings and stuff for it. There's something like about a third of all the non-forest land within a 2-hour commute of Tokyo Station is this fake farmland. Maybe some of it's real, but a lot of it's fake. Right? So first of all, tax it. Assess it and tax it the way it ought to be. That immediately brings in some revenue. Secondly, change the land usage laws. It's very hard in Japan to sell, not only to sell farmland to agribusiness, which could be more efficient. You can lease it to them, it's hard to sell it, but to non-farm uses. But in fact, studies have shown where it has been done, that if you could take this land and sell it to build offices and residences and retail outlets, etc., its value would be much, much greater. Change the land usage laws. Let these farmers sell the land. They'd earn a bundle. They wouldn't be called, allowed to call themselves fake farmers. I guess they could call themselves whatever they want, but they wouldn't, but they'd make a bundle. So buy it off. And there you have a situation where suddenly you've made available all this additional land where you could build stuff. That would in fact help stimulate growth. And I would also change the property taxes. Right now, the property taxes in Japan are very low on holding property, it would be land or developed land. But the capital gains taxes are actually relatively high compared to international standards. So if you got land or property you're doing nothing with, there's no tax penalty for doing nothing with the property. Right? But should you take the risk and put money into this thing, then the finance ministry takes away a lot of it. It should be the other way around. Raise the rate of holding property, so if you don't do anything with it, there's an actual tax penalty, so you have a real incentive to do something with it. And then if you go ahead and just make an investment and put money into it, you should actually keep the profits. For most of them, I mean some capital gains tax of course, but you want to incentivize development. So if you do these kinds of things, you would not only get tax revenue, you would help stimulate economic growth, which would bring bigger tax base and bring in even more revenue. And basically, in my view, there is no solution to the fiscal problem without higher returns on capital, better growth, a higher tax rate, so insurance companies can pay annuities. You're not going to be able to support the elderly without this kind of growth. So I went over to some friends at the Tax Bureau of the MOF and presented this some years ago, and I thought I was pretty clever. But the guy at the MOF, no, he didn't exactly, sorry, he didn't exactly use these words, but this is what he meant. What he meant was, sit down, sonny boy. He said, you think you're the only one who's thought of this? You think we're so stupid that we didn't think of this? We presented all this to the LDP back in the mid-1980s. And the LDP said, we can't do that. The real estate, this is when the land prices are still going up, the real estate lobby would kill us if we suddenly made more cheap land available. It would bring prices down. The farmers would kill us because they want to be farmers, even though they don't farm. We can't do it. So the consumption tax was in fact the fallback option. And believe it or not, Shun Kanemaru, the guy with all the gold bars, he had actually gotten a law through the Diet to establish in the 80s this citizen ID. And then it was revoked by the LDP before it actually could take effect. So these are not new ideas. These are not strange ideas. The reason they've not been imposed is not because people haven't thought of it, but because of the political obstacles. Now why the DPJ has got to carry on an LDP policy, I don't know. Because I thought the DPJ was supposed to be different from the LDP. But we have Ozawa trying to LDPize the DPJ in his way, through corruption and vested interests, and Noda LDPizing the LDP in his way by becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of the finance industry. Right? And I think what they're talking about is some kind of grand coalition. So the political cost and the economic cost of the consumption tax, in terms of what it's going to do to politics in this country, in terms of the fact that it's taken the Prime Minister's attention away from every other issue which needs to be addressed, and in terms of the impact of the consumption tax itself, I think are really, really the mistaken priorities. I think it's a bad move. we're now seeing in the press some economists being quoted as saying, gee, we're worried about the depressive effects of a hike in the consumption tax. Why they weren't being quoted 3 months ago, I don't know, but they weren't being. All right? Anyway, let me stop there, and hopefully this will be, rather than being Q&A, be an actual discussion. So that would be kind of fun. So let me just stop there and shut up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. Let me ask the first question. Is essentially your criticism is that in a recession it makes no sense to increase taxes or decrease government spending in a macroeconomic term. These, however, seem to be the policies followed by Japan, by the European Union, by the United States, at least by what Congress wants to do. Even though it flies against not only standard Keynesian theory, but really against generally accepted views of most economists, regardless of what they think about microeconomic regulation. How do you explain the success of these ideas? I mean, how have they kind of captured the entire political economy of most developed societies today?
That's a really interesting question. First of all, I beg to differ with you about the economist views, which is that there's a whole school of economics following Milton Friedman, et cetera, which has argued from time immemorial, and then there's the rational expectation of people and of other people, that in fact fiscal policy has no impact. Now, actual governments traditionally have not listened to that nonsense, but there has been that theory out there. In the last 10, 15 years, this whole idea of the magic of the marketplace has gone wild in all sorts of spheres, not just fiscal policy. I mean, the banking crisis that brought down the world economy was a direct result of this magic of the marketplace idea that we're going to have no regulations on subprime loans. We're not going to, not only we will not regulate derivatives, we won't even count them. And you had markets going nuts, people issuing fraudulent securities based upon nothing. And so this is part and parcel of this sort of this magic of the marketplace, free market stuff. And then you have economists arguing, not only does fiscal stimulus have no impact, in fact, fiscal austerity will promote growth, because if you cut budget deficits, then people will have more confidence. And because they have more confidence, they'll spend more, they'll invest more. And that was the theory that Cameron said. In Britain, other people in Europe have said, Merkel, et cetera, that growth through austerity produces confidence, confidence produces investment, investment produces growth. That's the theory. Well, we've had an experiment in that theory. It doesn't work.
Yeah, it's called the 1930s.
Well, no, we have an experiment right now in Europe. It's going on right now, right? But it is a repetition of our Herbert Hoover economics. It shouldn't have as much credibility as it does, and I think the European experiment is causing it to lose its productivity, lose its credibility, hopefully, but not entirely. People still buy it. I would think that one of the lessons is the U.S. did apply fiscal stimulus, a lot of it, and it avoided a much worse outcome than we otherwise would have had. But most Americans don't believe that.
Thank you very much. The floor is open to questions. Sado-san and then Paul. So here it's with you.
Thank you very much, Toshio the business line. My question, or my impression that to see the Japanese people who support the tax hike, it seems that they support the change because they fear that, particularly elderly people support the tax hike based on the fear that the social welfare they enjoy got some haircut. While relatively younger Japanese people who support the tax hike says the necessity of the package reform with social welfare. So it seems that it's the citizens are purely based on their interests, and also it's a generation war. What's your view on the situation?
Well, let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying the elderly support the tax hike because they want to preserve their benefits. And the young also support the tax hike because
yeah. There are some people who support the tax hike, but they also ask the package reform with social welfare.
Right. Okay. First of all, what the polls show that I've seen is that the majority, like 60% of the people, something like that, say eventually the consumption taxes must be raised, pay for Social Security. But about 50 or so percent, or 55%, depending on the poll, say, but we don't support raising them now. We don't support Noda's version. After the thing was passed, the polls showed most people did not support it. I think it was like 55 against and 40% for the bill that just passed the lower house. So the majority of people, in fact, are against raising taxes now, but they are for the idea that you have to raise them eventually, because they've been told that the only way to save Social Security is to raise taxes, and the only tax to raise is the consumption tax. They've not been offered an alternative other types of taxes. Your party is talking about other types of taxes, and we need that sort of discussion so that people have a menu. So partly, you know, people choose from among the alternatives that they're aware of. If you're told these are your only two choices, which one do you prefer? And you're not aware there's a third choice or a fourth choice out there, then it's kind of a rigged game. And I would argue that's what's going on. Now there is certainly a generational problem, which is if you have a demographic crunch, so that instead of having 5 workers for every retiree, you're going to have 2 workers for every retiree, then you're going to have a difficulty financing it. But what I would argue is that the answer to that is growth. And if we could turn the lights down 1 second again. So I'm going to, so I brought out these cool snazzy charts just so I could use them in the Q&A. Right? In any country, growth is the sum of how many additional workers do you have and how much additional GDP does each worker produce a year. So if you've got 1% more workers each year, and each worker can produce 2% more GDP, then 1 plus 2 gives you 3% GDP growth. Now in Japan, not only are there fewer workers, but their hours are being cut. The unemployment rate is low because, as you know, Japanese companies don't lay off people, they cut people's hours and their wages. So the work hours now are 10% below what they were in 1990. All of GDP growth has come from growth in productivity. And that productivity growth is pretty lousy. So if you're going to have only 2 workers per retiree, instead of having 5 like you used to have a decade or 2 ago, the only way you can finance that is if each worker produces a hell of a lot more GDP. That requires structural reform to produce growth. Noda has no interest in that. People who try to give him briefings on this have found him virtually falling asleep. I mean, the guy's fantasizing about taxes, talking about productivity, and the guy's having tax fantasies.
I'm getting the nukes back online.
You know? Excuse me?
I'm getting the nuclear reactors back online.
No, he doesn't fantasize about that too much. That's somebody else, right? So that's what you need is a productivity revolution, and we can talk about how you get that. But without getting growth back online, you cannot solve this problem. You will have this intergenerational warfare. You will basically, you're having a shrinking pie, and more people across generations, across sectors of the population, fighting over pieces of a shrinking pie. You've got to expand the pie, and that requires a productivity revolution. Who's next? Uh-oh.
I'd be interested if you can go back to the slide where you have...
Microphone.
I'd be interested if you go back to the slide where you had the percentages of income that were the result of the taxes, corporate.
This one?
Yeah, that one. Okay, so your proposal was, instead of raising the consumption tax, we have a property tax on the supposed underutilized farm land.
That's part of it, yeah.
Part.
The citizen ID, the
Right.
farmland.
Right.
These are all things I would do before I would use consumption tax as a last resort, certainly not as the first resort, yeah.
What I guess what I'd like you to please clarify is, have any studies been done to show how this would affect the farmers? I mean, obviously, if they're poor, this is one of the problems with paying such a tax. If it's going to have the same amount of effect in terms of national revenues as a 10% increase in the consumption tax, what impact this would have on farmland and farmers paying this kind of tax?
Okay. What I'm saying is that, you know, this is like having, in a sense, it's like having a tax on cigarettes. I mean, you have a tax on cigarettes, And the effect of having a high tax on cigarettes is to get people to smoke less. What Japan needs, in fact, is fewer farmers, more efficient farms that actually produce more food, would lower the prices of food, more imports of food that can be made more cheaply overseas. I forget the exact numbers, but because different sources differ, so I'm going to throw out a number. Let's say, whereas Americans might pay 12% of their household budget for food, Japanese are paying 20%. Europe is somewhere in between. A lot of protections in Europe as well. In the US too, but Japan is among the worst, right? So if you could lower food prices, you would in fact raise the income, the real income of consumers, give them even more purchasing power. So what you want to do, which is by the way part of the thing some of the Koreans are doing, is a policy which says we're going to have fewer farmers. Most farmers in Japan are actually part-time farmers. And those who call themselves full-time farmers are like in their late 60s.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're really saying is it's the property that's going to be taxed, the farmland property, correct?
The property will be taxed, but I'm saying if you change the land usage laws so that what was farm property can be sold and used for other uses where it has higher value,
okay,
the farmers will get a whole bunch of money from selling their land. It's their land, they get to sell it. When they sell it to somebody else who wants to build a housing project there, these farmers are going to get a whole bunch of money. So they'll get paid off, but the land will then be used for a more advantageous way that will build up GDP, will promote growth.
So your theory is raise the property tax for farmers to whatever, you never gave a number, but say 10% or whatever it was that you'd like it to go up to.
Just zone it as you zone
then
tax
this
land.
forces a rezoning because the farmers don't want it. So they want it to be rezoned now, to not be farmland.
Well, that's the land usage laws that allow farmers
that's
to
what you
sell
want,
farmland.
though,
Yeah, that's what I want,
effectively.
yeah. Yes.
And ultimately, though, the bureaucrats and politicians don't want to do this because currently farmers and real estate owners don't want this.
Well, I'm saying that the finance ministry bureaucrats had wanted to do this because they thought it was a good way to raise money. And it was the LDP which said no because it would hurt them in terms of campaign contributions and votes.
And do you think there's a lot of votes?
The reason why the Supreme Court made a ruling was because rural districts where the farm lobby is very powerful have a lot more seats in the House in the Diet than their share of the population. Yeah, there's a lot of votes. And some of them vote for the LDP, some of them vote for DPJ, and the rural sectors, the farm lobby, has a disproportionate veto power over other things. The agricultural ministry can veto an entire free trade agreement because they don't allow imports, they don't want to allow imports and all sorts of things. Absolutely. They're one of the biggest obstacles to reform. Is that more clear? Great. Who was next? I think you had your hand up, right?
Hi, I'm Kenneth McElwain from the University of Michigan. Paul kind of set up the conversation well because, I mean, I'm probably doing violence to the vast body of research you've done, but I think one recurring theme is the misalignment of political incentives away from consumers to rural vested interests of various types. So it's basically the solution to fix malapportionment.
That's absolutely is part of the solution. Absolutely. I don't think it's the entirety of the solution. I think one part of the solution is to fix malapportionment. That's necessary but not sufficient. One of the things that Japan needs, it seems to me, is when I was in Korea in 1999, we went to a conference and one of Kim Dae-jung's ministers addressed us, and he said, "You cannot have competitiveness without competition." I thought, boy, that should be the mantra, in the country. But it's just as true in politics as it is in business. Japan was, up until 2009, the last remaining one-party democracy in the entire rich world. Italy got rid of its, Scandinavia got rid of theirs. And lack of competition is just as stultifying in politics as in business. When you have one-party democracies, you have rigidity, you have stupidity, you often have corruption, more often than not. So what Japan needed as part of the solution is not only reapportionment, but also contested elections. One of the costs of what's going on now is what looks like to be a formal, possibly formal or informal sort of coalition between part of the DPJ and the LDP. It's also sort of a backhanded recombination of the old forces of resistance. And the opposite of them is going to be some irresponsible types like Ozawa and Hashimoto. The forces of reform do not now have an institutional vehicle. So there are a number of political things which would need to be done to overcome vested interest, of which one is malapportionment. But it seems to me contested elections are absolutely part of it, and I fear we're moving backwards on that front with this popularization of this notion. We've got decisions to make, we've got a twisted dial, we can't make decisions, let's have a grand coalition and make the decisions we got to make. Well, the decisions they're going to make, I think, are not going to be decisions which create the reforms that Japan needs to grow, to finance the elderly, to do all the other stuff it needs. Please.
I'm John Mock, I teach at
Mike?
I'm John Mock, I teach at Temple.
I teach at Temple. There you go. I have actually a couple of things as a preliminary and a question. The preliminary part is, first of all, I'm going to contribute to the drain of elderly people on the young people's budgets, and so I expect you guys to work hard to support me.
So you're about to retire, is that what you're saying?
I already have.
I thought you said you teach in the present tense.
I really don't look it, but I am Japanese. I retired from scuba, and now I'm teaching, quote, part-time at Temple.
Okay.
So, in any case, another codicil I'd like to throw in is at least part of me thinks that letting Tokyo become a complete and total rat hole is not necessarily something I think is a bad idea if it doesn't impact on the rest of the country. But it leads me to my question: if you redistrict land, and as you put it, get rid of fake farmland, which is, I think, in a way, a very arguable thing. I like the idea of voter IDs and all this. You're going to have a pretty interesting impact on density, population densities, on water flow, on a whole lot of things, not to mention the power grid, just because Paul's sitting here next to me. In terms of removing green space, which is already at a minimum, Tokyo has less green space than any other major metropolitan area in the world, including, frighteningly enough, Bombay. There are going to be some really major changes that you would make in terms of quality of life and other stuff in this circle you put to 2 hours around Tokyo Station, which gives you a long distance. 2 hours from Tokyo Station puts you up in Iwate. I don't know how you envision 2 hours, but it's by Shinkansen, that's one hell of a distance. Not quite. You're in Miyagi. Sorry, I lied. But if you take the farmland out and you don't have the green space, you're going to have a solid sprawl.
Okay, I was thinking of the five major prefectures around Tokyo Prefecture.
But in any case, the point is,
whatever.
If all five of those prefectures become solid urban sprawl,
okay,
you're going to have problems with water flow, you're going to have problems with lack of green space.
First of all, if
that.
you look at Chiba, for example, I said this is what proportion it was of the non-forest land. There's a lot of forest land in this area. I'm not saying, cut down every tree. There are ways to build cities and have green space in the cities. I got a friend who's involved who's in California, who's involved in what the hell do they call it? It's urban planning, but it's called, I was going to say easy living, but it's not easy living. But whatever, anyway, whatever it's called. He said, if you're in the city and if you actually have a tree belt along the sidewalks, your temperature, your ambient temperature is 5 degrees lower in the summer. And it's actually warmer in the winter, not to mention it's giving off some oxygen. So you actually use less energy. There's all sorts of things one can do, to combine good urban space, good urban planning with something that's livable cities, with all sorts of things. So I'm not talking about chaos, but the density in Japan. I haven't looked at these things in years, but if you look at sort of the different districts and how dense they are and how dense they're not, I don't think you're suddenly giving yourself a disaster because of you're allowing areas which are not being used well to be used for housing, for projects. You might actually be able to spread stuff out and have a more livable situation. I really don't see that as a problem.
No, you could do it, but I don't
See it being done in Japan. I mean, how much of this kind of planning do you see in the Tokyo metropolitan area? Almost none.
Well, the fact that it has not been done or has been done poorly doesn't mean it can't be done. I mean, I'm suggesting all sorts of things which haven't been done, but it doesn't mean it can't be done.
Well, okay,
Okay.
It's a vote
For you for king. But I know with the LDP doing it.
the gentleman with the massive beard.
Here and then and then we move to the back. This massive usually.
Well, 2 months ago. More massive than mine.
Wait a couple months, you ain't seen nothing yet. Backing up to what you were saying about the contested elections, it seems to me that the DPJ was originally and still is, for the most part, disaffected LDP factions. Essentially, it's still the names may have changed, but it's still essentially infighting among the ruling party. Some of them may call themselves the DPJ, but they're still essentially at least now refugees from the LDP for the most part. So does Japan is there? The names may change, but the story's the same essentially.
Okay, I got your point. This is what is said, that the DPJ is basically a combination of ex-LDPers, ex-socialists, whatever, right? Even before the 2009 landslide, about 2/3 of the DPJ Diet members, if my memory is correct, about 2/3 did not get into the Diet, or perhaps even local assemblies, until after the DPJ was formed. It was their first entry into politics was as a member of the DPJ. Now it's true at the very senior levels you have a lot of people who come from that background. Khan, by the way, was not. Khan's not ex-LDP. Certainly Hatayama, Noda, these people are. But the point is, this is a party which then recruited members of the Diet who came into politics as part of the DPJ. I think what happened with the DPJ is that they decided to ally with Ozawa, who in my view is the Prince of Darkness. Or from more of the Hindu side, both creator and destroyer. The guy who's created and destroyed more parties than anybody else, Shiva, exactly, than I can think of, right? And what happened was they made a deal with the devil, who said, gee, I can get you all these votes because I know how to get votes. And he recruited all these different people. He actually had been a consumption tax proponent who reversed himself. There's not a single policy which he cares about, aside from his own power, as far as I can see. And so he actually went out to recruit people and get votes in the rural sectors, seeing them as the swing factor. And then he said politicians should rule, not bureaucrats. Well, what people thought he meant was elected politicians, the elected prime minister and the cabinet should run things. What he really meant was that the unelected party secretary general, which by the way was also Stalin's original post, the unelected party secretary general will decide on budgets, and supplicants from the prefectures had to come to his headquarters and work with him to ask for this, that, the other thing. That's not politicians ruling, that's one unelected, corrupt politician under this fake slogan doing stuff. So, and then he appointed, just as he appointed a weak prime minister in Kaifu, he appointed a weak prime minister in Hatayama. When 2009 occurred, I was really, really happy, I was really optimistic. I had never imagined that the DPJ would mishandle things that badly, which I guess shows the lack of my imagination.
I did.
Okay.
And you
well, you were right and I was wrong. But the point is, all they had to do was handle things minimally competently, and they could have won a single party majority in the upper house in 2010. So we're in a mess. But I think there are reasons for the mess, but to say the DPJ is not and never was anything other than a bunch of ex-LDPers, I think is a mischaracterization of the nature of the DPJ. I really do.
Well, Prince of Darkness, Shiva, Destroyer,
And according to his wife, coward.
Devil, and Stalin. That's a pretty big achievement for a single man.
Yes, he is single now.
to raise your hand.
Boy, there's so many things. Just let me add one point about the relationship between the LDP and the DPJ is that the 3 prime ministers that the DPJ has had, none of them had their start in the LDP. So that's something to keep in mind.
Noda was never in the LDP?
Noda was, Hatayama's,
Hatayama's, I think
no,
Hatayama's LDP.
Hatayama's younger brother had a start.
They're both LDP. Khan, I think, is the only one who was not LDP, who's independent.
Okay, I can look it up. I'll just look it up. Okay, just two comments.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Your suggestion, the old MOF Fukuda's ID card and the ID taxpayer ID. That's basically an idea that's suggesting that tax income rather than consumption. Is that a correct understanding of what that the actual effect of that what that means?
My understanding is that you're talking about people who are evading personal income taxes, and by having tax ID, you avoid that. Yes.
Okay, and the other point is just when you talk about the farmers and the farmlands, I think you should avoid conflating the overrepresented rural districts out there in the boondocks like Iwate and Aomori, wherever, and the farming, the farmers and farming, the agriculture, mainly vegetables, agriculture and husbandry in the Tokyo and its 4 or 5 Kanto prefectures, and they're very different problems. And I think they probably deserve. You probably have to look to different solutions to these 2 problems, and I think the talk is somewhat conflated these 2.
What's the I don't quite get what the conflation of the problem.
I think it's sort of market gardening around Tokyo, which is efficient, and you know you can't import your lettuces from South America, for example, and then you've got your rice farmers in Iwate who are fundamentally inefficient. Would that be a fair characterization?
Well, from the stuff that I've seen, and certainly it's possible to be mistaken on it, a lot of what is zoned as farmland in these prefectures around Tokyo Prefecture is in fact very, very inefficient as farmland, and the people who are doing it are mostly, spend 85% of their income doing things other than farming, and the property land could be used for much better purposes than that. Who's next? Please.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I agree with you on your presentation by 90%. And my question is...
Maybe you should quit while I'm ahead.
My question is, what do you think would be the trigger for the transition for the next phase of this country? Meaning, the United States, imagine the Warren Code played a big role in the transition of the United States into the next
I'm
phase.
sorry, I didn't get the last part. Say that again.
Warren Code, the series of sentences given by the Warren Code and the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
So, this issue is really comprehensive issue, meaning the over-allotment of Japanese dioceses to rural election districts is a really big issue, but the Japanese constitution is lacking in a clear rule of allotment of each. This is really our proposal to. Am I making myself understand?
Yeah. I think if you're talking about the allotment here, I mean, I think one of the things you have is that the Japanese Supreme Court has been
a sleeping court. Really sleeping court. sleeping codes. So what do you think would be the trigger?
I got the question, so let me answer. First of all, as far as the court itself goes, it is within the OECD countries one of the most reluctant to overrule its legislature and to declare things unconstitutional. The court, while it has several times declared various elections unconstitutional, has never actually invalidated, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, has never actually invalidated an election because it was unconstitutional. If, for example, if Noda were to call an election without doing the reapportionment first, it is a real question in my mind whether or not the Supreme Court would in fact rule that invalid. I don't know what it would do, but its track record on that is certainly not strong. So that is that part of it. But what's the driver? Well, I think there's a whole bunch of different drivers, but part of it is the economics I was discussing before, which is why the LDP, I think, fell in the first place, which is the LDP, it existed, among other things, to support a bureaucracy which had policies that promoted growth in the high growth era, to keep them in power, let them do what they did, to distribute the fruits of growth in such a way that people were pretty happy with that growth, as well as keep Japan on the right side of the Cold War. In terms of domestic policy, so you helped promote winners, you compensated losers, you had these transitions, the income equality was pretty good, full employment was there. People generally thought things were getting better, their lives were improving, and so it was a catch-all coalition. As growth slowed down, partly as a result of, I think, bad policies, beginning in the Tanaka era, we began to get more and more of the LDP's constituencies fighting over shares of the shrinking pie. So you get the older versus the young, the rural versus the urban, blue-collar workers versus other types, mom-and-pop stores versus department stores, all kinds of different constituencies. So unless you solve this problem, then the economic strains become more and more difficult. People become more and more upset. They want change. Now, what we've seen in the last decade is a tremendous change in voter behavior. It used to be the case that voters in districts would vote for their Diet member not based upon what party he belonged to or the program of the party, but he was their local guy, and they supported him, and they support organizations. And in fact, Diet members could and did switch parties, and their entire support organizations and voter base would switch with them, and then they could switch back again. They could bequeath their Diet seats to their sons, their sons-in-laws, their political secretaries, whatever, and you maintain this organization, right? It's almost a hereditary kind of a thing, right? Now, what's happened in 2005 and 2009 is the voters got so upset that Koizumi did something in 2005 which no previous prime minister that I remember had done, which is he called a snap election and made it a referendum on an issue of policy. Now, I'm not particularly a fan that the postal privatization is the solution to all of Japan's problems. But Koizumi made it the symbol of reform. Are you for reform or not? If you reform, you got to support me in this postal thing. So he turned it into, in terms of people's state of mind, an issue of reform. And this whole idea of no growth without structural reform, right? He raised that consciousness. He made a referendum on that issue. And people overwhelmingly voted for it. And then having won by a landslide, and he was king, he did nothing with it. And when he left the scene, the LDP was the same party as it was before he got there. He was not transformational. He didn't change the LDP. And the LDP did not do what people had hoped it would do, Koizumi. And so in 2009, once again, people voted overwhelmingly for change. They just decided it was a different group that could bring about the change. They're willing to give the DPJ the benefit of the doubt. There's not enthusiasm for the DPJ, but there was enthusiasm for the possibility, right? And for the first time in history, the government changed hands as a result of post-war history. The government changed hands as a result of an election. It was a tremendous achievement, which the DPJ then proceeded to totally squander. And now people are really, really upset. But seats that people had won by 15, 20% were no longer safe seats. There's tremendous voter volatility, and that people, you did polls, people would vote not based on the local politician, but they were voting more based upon the party and what they expected or hoped that party would do in the way of performance. And these parties have failed to perform. So people are really, really upset. And no party gets the most votes. None of the above. And then people are so desperate they're willing to, if Hashimoto is in fact as bad as people in Tokyo say he is, then they're willing to vote for something which is quite wild. Actually, Japanese people like Mavericks. I mean, look what Koizumi's hair did for him. Right? People like Mavericks. They're willing to give this unknown a chance. So actually, I think the intersection between the poor economic performance and the voter reaction and voter volatility is, I think, one of the big drivers for that. What you've got to link that up with is tons of really, really sharp people among bureaucrats, among politicians, among academia and businessmen who have an idea what's going on. The tragedy of Japan is that the whole is so much less than the sum of the parts. Look what the auto companies did to regroup their supply chains after the disaster of March 31. Look at the way ordinary people acted. A friend of mine, an American, remarked to his wife, Japanese wife, how there was no looting in Japan after the tsunami. His wife said, "What's looting?" I mean, there is tremendous potential here which is not being tapped because of institutional obsolescence. That institutions which used to make sense no longer do, and they become an obstacle. So you get to go after everybody else goes. Okay, and then this gentleman had his hand up. Who's next?
Thank you for your great presentation. I want to ask you a question. I'm not an expert of economics, but I don't think it's possible to get enough budget, national budget, without raising consumption tax. Because after the earthquake, Japanese government changed the policy. Previously, Japanese government, planned to, decrease and say, incorporation tax. However, because of the earthquake, still has 30% or 35%, very, very high.
39%.
Among many countries all over the world. So, and you said, property tax, but I don't think it's possible enough. I don't think it's possible and enough. And of course, Korea, like Korea, give up, farming and importing. Yeah, it's a and implement free trade agreement. It's a very good way, one of the very good option. But I don't know actually the situation fit Japan or not. And my question, actually, I don't know so much, but so my question, one of my question is, which percentage, national budget occupies and GDP, and what is the goal? For example, Reagan implemented Reaganomics and deregulation. So, if national budget is decreased and free economy, do you think it's a goal of Japanese economic situation? But you said, answering his question, it's not the goal. So, what do you think of the goal of Japanese or ideal situation of Japanese economics?
Okay, the ideal, that's a big topic, but I'll discuss one aspect. So one issue is, I think the first question there was, you got to raise the consumption tax because these other taxes won't raise enough money. You know what? We don't actually know until we try it. So there might come a day at which point, then this gentleman is next after that. No, he's next, and then him. Okay? No, you first, and then him. Right? But I got to answer the other question first. So hold on. Right? So the argument is made that there's no other tax which will raise enough money other than the consumption tax. What I'm saying to you is, let's try these other things first, and let's see what they do. That's number one, which is try the citizen ID. Go for the property tax together with the land usage change. I mean, the property tax alone without the land usage change, you can do it. But the most fundamental thing is that we saw you know, in this chart, that the most fundamental thing is growth. If your economy is growing, then your tax base is growing, right? And you have the tax base that you can use to provide tax revenue. You're also spending less on welfare, less on unemployment compensation, less on fiscal stimulus, etc. So I don't think there's any, you know, particularly, you know, perfectly designed tax that could come close to solving the problem unless there's solid economic growth. And that is the most fundamental issue, and it's the one that's being ignored. As far as the share of the government in GDP, when you look at the OECD has got numbers which show for all levels of government, you know, the national government, the local governments, prefectural, etc. And not only the government spending directly, but income transfers, Social Security. My memory is it's about, it's somewhere in the mid-30s, about 35 or 36% of GDP. I mean, it's not a precise number, but it's in that range. Now, the growth of government spending in Japan, as in other countries having aging, and certainly true in the US, is not the government's own direct spending. Public works have been slashed in Japan. You know, the amount of money you see in the GDP tables, what the government itself spends on salaries for government workers, on building schools, building roads, paying the police, paying the army, whatever, has actually gone down as a share of GDP. The real source of the problem are the income transfers for the elderly, and also health care, because the elderly need more health care. That's the problem in Japan, that's the problem in the US, it's the problem elsewhere. Right? That's what's going on. You have to have a way to finance that. Now you could starve all the old people, I guess, if you want to, but that's probably not going to be politically acceptable.
We don't need them.
Right? And if you're 65, if you've already hit age 65 in Japan, your life expectancy is pretty high. You have an awful lot of, I mean, I think it's what, 80, whatever, 82 at birth. But if you've already made it to 65, you know, it's probably in the high 80s. You've got a lot of years to live to draw on your savings, whatever, but ultimately it's the base of production. So if you've got 5 elderly for every worker, and then you go to you got 5 workers for every elderly person, you can handle it. If you only got 2 workers for every elderly person, it's a lot tougher. That's the most basic problem that Japan faces. As far as how to stimulate that productivity, I'll wait till somebody asks me. Okay, you were next. Yes.
Thank you very much for that wonderful lecture. I am very happy to be here tonight because you are the first one to give us the assurance about Japan not going to like the Greece in the 10 years time. With that assurance, I feel very comfortable about the situation that we are facing right now. The landslide victory to GDP will be the next one to lose. So that GDP as well as Liberal Democratic Party will lose at the next general election, DPJ and the LDP. That's a good thing, because the position that I'm thinking it is now is the second enlightenment period for the citizens like myself, ordinary citizens or ordinary voters, to think about the options that the Japan may have to the future, nearest future and long-term future. We haven't established a strategy of the national level, and energy crisis is not resolved. And farmers, you mentioned, are aging population. The top example at the age 67 in Iwate, where I was born. So all these things are naturally resolved. No farmers in the end, for instance. And also rezoning, like the tsunami hazard district areas. Hazard district was assigned, but not others. So there was no way to establish the new industry. So the solution is for them to think and resolve. That's the good starting point of the democracy. So we are facing the early stage of the real challenge to create our own democracy. And Japan is not stupid, I hope. And I belong to the elderly people, and I'm receiving the offers of the national security, national health planning, all these horrible things, which I don't get any benefit of it, because it is my will not to close to the hospitals. So that this is a good challenge and high hurdle to overcome, but I think Japan will be okay. What do you think?
Well, I wrote a book in 2002 called Japanese Phoenix, The Long Road to Economic Revival. I guess it should have been called The Long, Long, Long Road to Economic Revival, although I did think it was going to be years.
You said 10. You promised us 10. I think it's been more than 10.
You know what? I don't recall. I thought in 1998 I said I said no more than 20, so that gives me what 6 more years. Anywho, I don't think I said 10, but anyway, I think I said no less than. I think I said no less than 10. I said 10 to 20 is what I believe I said in 2002. Now, because I said even if Japan did all the right things today, which it ain't going to do, it would still take 5 years or so to have built critical mass to get these things through. Look, I think on the political forecast, I mean, I'm talking to a bunch of people. The consensus view right now, which could be totally wrong, but the consensus view that I was hearing from both DPJ and LDP Diet members this week was the DPJ would win about 100 seats, plus or minus. The LDP would win about 200 seats, plus or minus. And then the Kome'd say 20 or 30. Now, Hashimoto, somewhere between 30 to 50, God knows. It all depends upon when the election has. I think the LDP now wants to delay the election until people are less angry about the tax hike and some other things, right? So, you could very well have a situation where the LDP would like to, its favorite scenario is it wins enough votes together with the Kome'd to grab some independents that can rule without the DPJ. But the fallback scenario for the LDP is that neither the LDP Komeito coalition nor the DPJ have got enough votes to put together a government, and then the LDP forms in effect a coalition with a refashioned DPJ minus Ozawa and that crowd. That's sort of the LDP scenario, what they'd like to do. But the people are very, very disgruntled right now. The people are very, very volatile. The dust has to settle. We don't know yet what Ozawa's going to do, or Noda's going to react. It's going to be months before the election, you know. So I don't know what's going to happen. But I do think, whatever happens this particular year, I don't see this idea of the Grand Coalition as a recipe for stability, because it can't solve Japan's problems. I see an era of more party turbulence, more realignments, more splits, etc., like we had in the 1990s. That's what I think it's going to look like.
We have time for
You were next.
questions. So very short question, and then maybe you get the microphone, and then you'll answer everything.
Thank you very much.
It was supposed to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the lecture. I pretty much agree with everything that you said. In terms of the besides sales tax, here's my question to you. What do you think idea of taxing more pachinko industry, which is like $30 trillion industry?
I'm sorry, say again?
What do you think, besides raising consumption tax, which I'm against too, what do you think idea of raising a pachinko tax, which is like a 30 trillion yen industry, or like religious institutions, which is, their property itself is worth more than 20 trillion yen. Besides their piece of paper with weird printings on, they sell for like 10 million yen or something like that.
Okay, so but we have to be kind of short on the.
Okay, I got the concept.
Who else had okay, so yeah, very brief question.
And also the elderly spend their 800 trillion yen savings.
Okay, so.
You want to get the other question first?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
We'll run them, and there's one question here.
My question is very succinct. Where does the productivity growth come from?
Okay.
And you can ask a question without the microphone.
Yeah, I have a question about globalization. One of the things that is saving Japan now is the income from Japanese investment abroad, right? But that really means that many of the corporations are now operating abroad, which reduces the taxes coming from corporations. So it kind of creates this dilemma for the Japanese government that, yes, it's great to have this income from all these FDIs that were operating in Thailand and the US and so on and so forth, but they really cannot tax them because of that type of kind of following out. Right? So I think
Okay, I got it.
Okay, and Siegfried, very short.
Oh, good question.
A little bit louder.
No, I am one only.
Which way should Japan go to for a better productivity in this?
That's what he already asked.
Okay, so that's great. That's great. That's
Okay. We can do price of one.
So you wrap it up.
Okay.
You can
I have never looked at
you
the
can
issue.
choose. You can answer some questions. You can answer none.
Okay.
All.
Never looked at the pachinko tax, religious institutions. I'm willing to have experts look at it, see what they come up with, and then look at that. But I've never looked at it, so I don't know. As far as a wealth tax on the elderly, that's a possibility. But you know, if you're going to do it, I'd be careful, because you've got an awful lot of people who actually have to live off of those savings and draw down principal, especially since they're getting about 0 interest rate. So when you talk about all the savings of the elderly, how many of those are actually held by truly rich people? You know, Japan is not America, where you have a bunch of people who are obscenely wealthy for no good reason. Some people are obscenely wealthy for good reason. They actually did something. They created companies, right? So I'm not sure how much money is there and how much you do without really causing a problem. But again, it's something that I've thought a little bit about, but I've not read serious studies about it, so I just don't have an opinion. Productivity growth is more complicated, so I'm going to say that for last. Globalization. Yeah, I'm not sure how much of the income comes from, an awful lot of the income doesn't just come from corporations building plants overseas. A lot of it comes from, you know, people put their money in banks, insurance companies, and others who buy bonds overseas where they can earn a higher interest rate. They have some currency risk which they hedge. So that stuff is going to occur anyway, and that tends to be a net benefit for Japan under the current situation. The problem with, there's a difference between what I would call globalization and hollowing out. That is, if you look in the United States, there's controversy about it, but there are studies that show, you know, that the investments overseas did not substitute for American exports, but they actually in some ways help supplement it, because, for example, if Ford Europe is selling stuff, it's going to sell stuff that it would not have been able to export from the U.S. So there's a lot of intra-firm trades. The U.S. will export stuff to Ford Europe. But the U.S. is also attracting investment from other countries into America. The problem with Japan, one problem is that while its companies are investing overseas, there are all kinds of institutional blockages, including the ability to actually buy out a company, that don't give the same sort of inward foreign direct investment that would cause a balance. But I think, in general, globalization, by which I mean trade and direct investment, I mean hot money flows. Countries that do more of that tend to grow faster. Productivity. Okay, here you go. Companies create productivity, right? Now, there are OECD has done studies on this, and Professor Fakao from Totsubashi has done some very good work on this, which is summarized in a report put out by the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan called New Sources of Growth. And I met with Fakao the other day. He's terrific on this stuff. Okay. So, there are 3 ways in which companies create productivity. One is that existing companies do what they're already doing, but they do it better. Right? Second way is, within a given sector, better companies take away market share from inferior companies. For example, in Japan, large retail stores have much higher productivity in terms of sales per employee or sales per square foot, whatever, than small mom and pop stores. So better firms take away market share from inferior firms. And the third way is the turnover of firms. That bad firms die and new, better firms replace them, either in the same sector or in different sectors. Now, it turns out for the average country in the world, it turns out that first of all, incumbent firms have the best rate of productivity growth the more competition they face. Mehdi's got it absolutely wrong when Mehdi says the reason why Hyundai and Samsung are doing so well is because they have monopolies in their own country. No, it's because they face international competition. The most productive Japanese firms are the ones that compete on the world stage. So, if you want competitiveness, you've got to have competition. But about a third of productivity growth comes from the birth and death of firms. Now, most new firms that are created die, about 90%, at least in the US. But the firms that survive change the entire economy. And you're talking about firms that start small, could be 5 people, they could grow to 200 people. You've never heard of them. But then there are the Googles and the Amazons and whatever, right? And they come up with new products and new ideas. Japan has got the lowest rate. So this is kind of like a Darwinian evolution, natural selection. Japan, first of all, has the lowest rate of firm turnover in the OECD. Why? Because in Japan, your social safety net is your firm. You don't have a strong society-wide social safety net that allows you to move from firm to firm, from job to job, and being helped with transition. So you've got to preserve these zombie firms as a kind of a disguised unemployment. Worse yet, according to Powell, in most countries, the firms that die have poor productivity compared to the firms that remain. It's survived, the least fit die. In Japan, the firms that leave Japan or just go out of existence have higher productivity than the firms that remain. How could that be, I said? He says, because of hollowing out. That your auto firm will shut down a factory in Japan, an electronics firm will shut down a factory in Japan and go to Malaysia. So you're having survival of the least fit. You're driving the best out. It's the theory of comparative disadvantage, right? So what you need, therefore, is these are the ways in which we've seen in country after country that you have this kind of productivity. Now, one final thing on that. If you look at the US productivity revolution, people tell you it's the new economy. It ain't so. First of all, there's no new economy. It's the same old economy, just with new technology. But most of the acceleration in US productivity from 1995 onward did not come from the technology producing industries. It came in the old line, so-called old economy industries that used this new technology and combined it with old technology under the pressure of competition. Talking about retail, where you're marrying cheap communication with optical scanners. Talking about continuous casting and steel, reorganization within manufacturing. You're talking about banking, not the stuff they do with the funny money derivatives, but the ATMs and things of this type, right? And so, the same thing is true in Japan. Japan's manufacturing, while certain sectors have very high productivity, overall, Japan's manufacturing is 30% below the productivity level of the US. The service sector is even worse. Economists call this the advantage of backwardness. If Japan were, over the next 20 years, to get itself up to the world benchmarks in productivity, it could grow 3.5% a year, according to economists who've looked at it. So by transforming, through structural reform, your backward industries, through more competition, you can promote growth. You're shaking your head. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
That's right, yes. You've got no politicians left who support structural reform. They're all gone. And if there were ever any. So, how do we get that structural reform? If it is primarily a political
There is right now, absolutely, there's reform fatigue. We're not going to have it. But sooner or later, if Japan doesn't want to starve all its old people to death, doesn't want to stop having jobs for its younger people, it damn well better have structural reform. And there are people out there who know this, but they lack a political vehicle at the present time. But as far as talking about the present moment, I mean, there are people who, it's not that people don't believe in it, but they can't talk about it now under the present circumstances. That is another cost of what Noda has done. And that part I agree with.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
I'm done.
Okay, thank you very much.